Thousands of Parisian women walked nearly 12 miles through rain and mud toward Versailles because bread had become too expensive, too scarce, and too political to ignore. Think about that. The same food that helped build 10,000 years of civilization could also help drag an untouchable king back to Paris. Not cake, not luxury, bread. Within years, the old French monarchy was gone. That is the hidden power of the loaf. It fills stomachs, builds cities, pays armies, measures class, and when it fails, shakes thrones. But Paris is not where this story begins. The first clue is older than farms, older than cities, older than writing. A stone hearth in what is now northeastern Jordan, where before farming, there was flatbread. Bread looks simple because it sits quietly on the table. Flour, water, heat, maybe yeast, maybe salt. But behind that ordinary slice is one of the longest experiments humans ever ran. To make bread, people had to notice wild grasses, gather tiny seeds, grind them with stone, mix them into paste, control fire, share labor, store grain, defend harvests, invent ovens, invent accounts, and eventually invent governments strong enough to keep the whole system moving. Bread was not a side dish to civilization. In much of the ancient world, it was the machine civilization ran on. The first surprise is that bread is older than farming. At Shubaika 1, a Natufian site in the Black Desert of northeastern Jordan, archaeologists found charred crumbs in ancient fireplaces. Under a microscope, those crumbs were not just random burnt plant bits. They were bread-like remains, made from processed wild plants, including wild cereals and tubers, and dated to about 14,400 years ago. That is roughly 4,000 years before agriculture was fully established in Southwest Asia. Picture the scene without the romance polished onto it. The air is dry, the ground is stony, wild grasses rattle in the wind. Someone crouches by a hearth, holding a lump of damp meal that has been pounded and ground until the sharp, brittle seeds turn into something almost silky. It is not white flour, it is darker, earthier, flecked with husk and root. When it hits the hot stone, the paste tightens. The outside blisters, the edges char. Smoke catches the nose first, then the toasted smell of starch changing under heat. This was not bread as a modern bakery would define it. It was probably flat, coarse, and chewy. But it crossed a boundary. Humans were no longer just eating plants as they found them. They were dismantling plants, recombining them, and making a new food. That mattered because wild grain is stubborn food. A seed is tiny. Its protective coat fights the teeth. Gathering enough for a single family's dinner takes hours of patient work in the field. Then grinding begins, and grinding never stops quickly. Picture one person leaning into a saddle quern, arms pushing forward, drawing back, pushing forward again, turning handfuls of grain into gritty flour one stroke at a time, for hours, before the first loaf can be formed. So why do it? Because grain had a secret. Once dried, it could wait. Meat spoiled, fruit bruised, leaves wilted. Grain could be carried, stored, counted, and cooked when the season turned hard. Bread began as a food, but it pointed toward a new kind of life. One where tomorrow's meal could be hidden in yesterday's harvest. And once people learned that, the ground itself began to look different. Wild cereals did not look like the tame fields we imagine now. Early wheat and barley grew in patches across the Fertile Crescent, a broad arc reaching through the Levant, northern Mesopotamia, and into parts of Anatolia and Iran. The seeds were small, the stalks shattered easily, scattering grain before a person could collect it. But to hunter-gatherers who already knew seasonal landscapes in astonishing detail, those grasses were not random weeds, they were a calendar. When the heads ripened, people returned. They cut, beat, gathered, carried, dried, and ground. The more they depended on grain, the more useful it became to stay near it. A camp that once moved with gazelle, nuts, and fruit could begin to linger near stands of cereal. A hearth became a repeated place. A grinding stone became worth keeping. A storage pit became worth guarding. Bread rewards staying put, not instantly and not everywhere, but powerfully enough to change the choices people made. If a family had spent days harvesting wild barley, the harvest itself became an anchor. You don't casually walk away from food that can survive the winter. Over generations, people selected the plants that were easiest to harvest. Seeds that stayed attached to the stalk long enough to be gathered had an advantage in human hands. Fields slowly became more human-shaped. By around 10,000 years ago, communities in Southwest Asia were cultivating and domesticating cereals. Work harder now, eat later, stay longer, build heavier things. The first villages were not born from comfort. They were built around risk. If you plant grain, the rain can fail. If you store grain, someone can steal it. If you depend on bread, you need cooperation, rules, and memory. As soon as grain became a stored future, people needed places large enough to protect it. At Neolithic sites, such as Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, occupied for centuries after about 7100 BCE, grain foods were part of daily household life. Archaeobotanical work has identified cereal-based food remains there, evidence that people prepared grain as breads, porridges, or related foods. Çatalhöyük was not a city in the later imperial sense. It was a dense settlement of mud brick houses, entered through roofs, with hearths and ovens inside domestic spaces. Bread lived inside the house. It shaped the rhythm of ordinary rooms. Grain had to be stored away from damp and pests. Flour had to be ground on heavy stones that wore the body over time. Dough had to be mixed, shaped, watched, and pulled from heat at the right moment. If you've ever smelled bread browning, you know why this food became emotionally powerful. The smell moves ahead of the meal. It says heat, safety, people nearby. But in a Neolithic home, that smell came with smoke in the eyes, grit under the fingers, and the ache of labor. Ancient bread could be dense and tooth-wearing. Stone grinding left mineral grit in flour. Bread fed people, but it also marked them. As villages grew, the grain cycle made time more organized. There was a season to plant, a season to weed, a season to harvest, a season to thresh, a season to grind. Food became less like a lucky find and more like a schedule. That schedule could support more children, more stored calories, and more specialization. If not everyone had to search for food every day, some people could build, weave, trade, worship, count, and rule. But specialization creates dependence. A potter still needs bread. A builder still needs bread. A priest still needs bread. Once enough people stopped producing all their own food, the question changed from what can we eat today to who controls the grain. That question would follow bread into the first cities. In southern Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, grain became the foundation of urban life. By the late 4th millennium BCE, places like Uruk were larger and more complex than earlier villages by an order of magnitude. They needed irrigation canals, labor crews, storage rooms, and systems for distributing food. Bread and beer, both made from cereal, became central to that system. One of the oldest surviving pieces of writing is not a poem about love or a king boasting about victory. A late Uruk clay tablet in the British Museum, dated around 3100 to 3000 BCE, records beer using impressed numerical symbols. Before writing preserved epics, it preserved rations. Before it carried literature, it carried quantities. The logic is brutal and elegant. Grain can be measured, flour can be measured, loaves can be issued. Workers digging canals or building temple platforms cannot be paid with vague promises. They need calories. A ration bowl and a loaf are administrative tools. Clerks press numbers into wet clay to track what workers received, what grain entered the storehouse, what left by cart. A day's wage in Mesopotamia could be 3 to 5 liters of barley, pressed into a tablet before it was pressed into bread. In a small band, sharing food can be personal. In a city, food becomes bureaucratic. A worker receives a set amount. A temple stores huge quantities. An official counts what others grew and records it in clay. The loaf becomes a unit inside a hierarchy. And yet, without that hierarchy, the city struggles to exist. Irrigation agriculture in Mesopotamia required coordination because rivers brought both life and danger. Canals had to be maintained. Fields had to be allocated. Harvests had to be moved. Farmers produced grain. Institutions stored it. Workers received rations, and cities rose out of mud brick and accounting. A field of barley became a tablet became an order became a wall, a temple, a canal, a city. Once bread could be counted, Hands pressing clay made the empire. Along the Nile, grain was life because the river made agriculture unusually dependable. Each year, the flood spread silt across the fields. When the water withdrew, farmers planted emmer wheat and barley in soil, renewed by the river. From that cycle came bread, beer, taxes, labor, and pyramids. Ancient Egyptian bread was not one thing. Tomb scenes and archaeological finds show loaves in many shapes: round, conical, long, flat, thick, and molded. Some were everyday food, some were offerings for the dead. Worker ration records from sites like Deir el-Medina, the village of Theban tomb craftsmen, document 10 loaves and a measure of beer per day for an ordinary laborer, enough calories to sustain heavy stonework under desert sun. Egypt provides some of the clearest early evidence for sophisticated baking and fermentation. Microscopic study of ancient Egyptian baking and brewing residues has shown cereal processing involving malted and cooked grains. A wet grain mixture left exposed allows wild yeasts and bacteria to begin working. They feed on sugars, release gases, and change flavor. The dough softens, swells, and turns faintly sour. Bake it, and the result is lighter, more aromatic, more alive in the mouth. The same grain world could produce both a loaf and a drink, and the processes overlapped far more than modern grocery aisles suggest. For laborers, bread and beer were staples. For the state, grain was taxable wealth. Egypt's administrators measured fields, assessed harvests, and stored grain in large facilities. A bad Nile flood could become a political emergency because bread depended on water arriving in the right amount. A loaf in Egypt was the edible form of the Nile's reliability. It fed the people who cut stone, dragged sledges, plastered walls, and painted tombs. It fed priests. It fed scribes who recorded the grain that fed everyone else. And from Egypt, bread moved deeper into empire, trade, and identity. By the time Greek cities and later Rome inherited the grain cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean, bread had become a marker of class. The same field could become many kinds of food, depending on grinding, sifting, and access. Fine flour required more processing. Coarse bread held more bran and grit. Fresh bread from a skilled baker meant something different from a hard ration carried by a soldier. The Greeks had public bakeries in some cities, and professional bakers became part of urban life. Bread appeared beside olives, cheese, wine, fish, and legumes. It was eaten by hand, dipped, torn, used almost like a tool. A loaf could be plate, utensil, and meal at once. Rome expanded that logic to an imperial scale. The city of Rome grew far beyond what its nearby farmland could reliably feed. By the late Republican Empire, grain shipments from Sicily, North Africa, and especially Egypt became politically vital. Ships loaded with Egyptian grain sailed north through Alexandria, crossed the open Mediterranean, and unloaded at Ostia, Rome's harbor. From there, barges moved cargo upriver. The Mediterranean was not just a sea, it was a grain conveyor. Armies march on calories before they march on glory. A Roman soldier's ration often included grain, which could be ground and cooked into porridge or bread. A legion needed weapons, yes, but also mills, pack animals, roads, storage, and supply discipline. If the grain failed to arrive, courage did not solve the problem. A person standing in Rome with a loaf in hand might be eating the result of Egyptian floodwaters, North African fields, ship captains, dock workers, millers, bakers, and state policy. One bite connected provinces, and that connection made bread dangerous when it failed. Rome's leaders understood that a hungry city was not just sad, it was unstable. The grain dole, known as the annona, became one of the great political facts of Roman life. By the 1st century BCE, around 200,000 citizens in Rome received subsidized or free grain. By the height of empire, records suggest that number had grown to roughly 300,000 recipients receiving monthly allotments, each enough for about half a month's bread. The exact arrangements changed across centuries, but the principle was clear: feed the population or risk disorder. This was statecraft, not charity. An emperor could build arches, mint coins, and command armies, but if ships failed to bring grain across the sea, ordinary people felt the failure in their bellies. The system required astonishing logistics. Grain from Egypt traveled down the Nile to Alexandria, crossed roughly 1,500 miles of open Mediterranean, entered the harbor at Ostia, transferred to river barges, and arrived at Rome's warehouses before it could be issued and baked. Every stage could fail. Bad harvests, Mediterranean storms, piracy, corruption, war, storage rot. A loaf in Rome carried the risk of an entire supply chain. Urban scale creates dependency, and dependency creates politics. A village can sometimes survive on mixed local food. An imperial capital with more than 1 million people cannot forage when ships are late. The Roman poet Juvenal criticized the public appetite for bread and circuses, but the phrase survives because it names a real structure. All complex societies must answer the same question: how do you keep dense populations fed when most people are no longer growing their own food? Rome's answer was conquest, taxation, shipping, milling, baking, and distribution. It worked for centuries. It also meant that a disruption in one province could echo through the capital. This is the part of the story most people never learn. Once grain became taxable, storable, and essential, rulers could demand it. Once people depended on fields, granaries, mills, and ovens, they could be trapped by them. Bread fed workers, but it also made workers visible to power. In ancient states, grain taxes could be assessed, collected, stored, and redistributed. That sounds administrative, but behind every measure was labor. Someone had to plow, someone had to sow, someone had to harvest under heat, someone had to haul sacks heavy enough to bend the back, someone had to grind grain day after day until palms hardened and shoulders ached. In many ancient societies, the people doing the hardest food labor were not the people writing the records. Enslaved people, dependent laborers, peasants, women in households, prisoners, and corvée workers all appear in different historical settings around the grain economy. Bread's beauty and bread's burden were never evenly shared. Grinding alone was punishing. Before large mechanical mills became widespread, hand grinding on stones could consume hours each day in a household. The sound would have been constant in many settlements. Scrape, push, scrape, push. There was also ecological pressure. Irrigation could increase yields, but in places like southern Mesopotamia, long-term salinization damaged fields as salts built up in the soil over centuries. Grain systems were powerful, but they could exhaust land, concentrate wealth, and deepen dependence on states that controlled water and storage. Bread's dark turn is not that bread was bad. It is that a food this useful could be captured by power. The same loaf that kept a child alive could also mark a tax debt, a ration line, a military campaign, or a labor obligation. And once that was true, bread was ready to become a weapon. Follow the grain routes, and the map changes. The Roman need for wheat helped bind North Africa, Sicily, and Egypt to the imperial center. Later, as political control shifted, those same grain regions remained prizes because bread demand did not disappear when dynasties changed. In the Byzantine world, the grain supply of Constantinople mattered enormously. The city sat between Europe and Asia, controlling passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Its people still needed bread. Its armies still needed supplies. Etymology carries this history in small pieces. The English word lord comes from Old English hlafod, often understood as loafward, the guardian or keeper of bread. Lady is linked to hafdej, associated with kneading or preparing bread. These word histories are debated in their fine details, but the broad connection is telling. Social rank was imagined through the loaf. That idea shows up in practice too. A port expanded because grain moved through it. A road was repaired because grain carts used it. A tax district formed because wheat fields needed administration. A region was conquered because a capital city could not eat without it. Not every landscape wanted wheat. In colder or poorer soils, rye and barley mattered. In mountain zones, people relied on mixed grains. In hard years, acorns, chestnuts, legumes, and roots filled gaps. The ancient and medieval breadbasket was not one golden field. It was a patchwork of survival. But where wheat could grow and be moved, cities followed. And wherever cities grew large enough to depend on distant grain, the politics of hunger waited for its moment. In medieval Europe, bread was everywhere, but it was not the same bread for everyone. The wealthy could eat whiter, finer wheat bread. Poorer people often ate darker loaves made with rye, barley, oats, maslin, or mixed grains. The difference was visible. Class had a color, a crust, and a chew. A medieval meal might use a trencher, a thick slice of stale bread, as a plate beneath meat or stew. After soaking up juices, it could be eaten or given away. Bread was not background, it was architecture on the table. In England, the assize of bread and ale, formalized in the 13th century, tied the price and weight of bread directly to the cost of grain. When wheat cost 12 pence per quarter, a farthing loaf had to weigh at least 24 shillings and 16 grains. If the price of wheat rose to 18 pence, that same farthing bought only a loaf weighing about 16 shillings. Bakers found selling light loaves faced fines, public humiliation, or being dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf tied around their neck. Customers could feel the law in their hands every time they lifted a loaf. That sounds technical until you imagine the market. A buyer picks up a loaf that should feed a family and feels it too light. The crust smells right, but the weight is wrong. In a world where bread can be half the meal or more, a missing handful of flour is not a small cheat. It is hunger, encoded in policy and punished in public. Bread also carried fear. Rye, infected with ergot, a fungus that can produce toxic compounds, caused outbreaks of ergotism in parts of medieval Europe. A staple food could nourish, and under the wrong conditions, harm whole communities. By the later Middle Ages, bread had become a daily negotiation among field, mill, oven, market, law, and body. Bread riots were not random bursts of anger. They were often moral arguments in the street. Ordinary people believed there was a fair price for bread, a proper weight, and a duty by authorities to prevent hunger. When those expectations broke, crowds acted. In early modern Europe, grain prices could swing sharply because harvests were local and transport was limited. A bad season, a war, hoarding, or export at the wrong moment could turn bread from staple into crisis. People watched wagons, granaries, mills, and markets because they knew exactly where hunger entered the chain. France made the link between bread and politics unforgettable. In the late 1780s, bad harvests and economic strain pushed bread prices upward. For many Parisian workers, bread consumed as much as 80 to 90% of a laborer's daily wages in the worst months of 1789. In October of that year, thousands of women marched to Versailles, demanding bread and confronting royal power. The march helped force Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette back to Paris. A food crisis did not cause the French Revolution by itself, but bread scarcity gave political anger a body and a direction. This is where the opening loop begins to close. The loaf that started as charred paste on a stone had become a test of legitimacy. Could a ruler keep bread affordable? Could a city trust the market? Could a state move grain fast enough? Bread did not topple every throne it touched, but when a society was already strained by debt, inequality, war, or distrust, bread could turn pressure into motion. It gave crowds a shared demand that no one had to explain. Bread was not ideology. Bread was breakfast, and that is why the history of bread cannot be separated from the history of power. The quieter the loaf looks, the more dangerous its absence becomes. The modern loaf changed through machines. Roller milling in the 19th century made it easier to produce fine white flour at scale. Railroads moved grain across continents. Steamships compressed distance. Industrial ovens standardized baking. In 1930, Wonder Bread began selling pre-sliced loaves nationally across the United States, bringing the soft, uniform, enriched sandwich loaf into American kitchens on an industrial scale. Then, in January 1943, the US government banned the sale of sliced bread entirely, citing wartime needs for wax paper and steel. Americans complained loudly enough that the ban lasted only a few months. The protest over losing pre-sliced bread was itself a measure of how completely the convenience had remade daily life in just over a decade. The original commercial slicing had begun in 1928 at the Chillicothe Baking Company in Missouri, using a machine developed by Otto Rohwedder. A loaf that arrived already cut, saved time, fit the new rhythm of sandwiches, school lunches, and factory schedules, and made uniform toast a domestic standard. But industrial bread also changed what people expected bread to be. Softness became a selling point. Uniformity became comfort. Whiteness, once a sign of expensive refinement because fine flour took more labor, became widely available. Labor hid inside factories and supply chains instead of showing on the crust. The scale is staggering. A single modern grain elevator can hold more than 1 million bushels, enough to supply a medieval city for years. Wheat can be harvested by combines, moved by rail, priced in global markets, and turned into flour far from the field. That stretching brought abundance, but also fragility of a new kind. Weather in one region, war in another, fuel prices, shipping routes, fertilizer costs, and trade policies can all affect the price of bread far away. The ancient problem never vanished. It got bigger. The loaf became softer, faster, cleaner, and more predictable. But underneath the plastic bag, it was still the same ancient equation: grain, power, labor, risk, and trust. Today, bread is so common that it can disappear into routine. Toast before work, a roll beside soup, a pita wrapped around lunch, a tortilla, a naan, a baguette, a bagel, a sourdough boule cooling on a rack. The forms differ, but the structure is ancient. Ground grain, water, heat, human choice. The word companion comes from Latin roots meaning with bread, the person you break bread with. Lord traces to Old English loafwood. In many languages, the word for bread stands close to the word for food itself. Etymology is not proof, but it is a record of what people felt was worth naming together. Archaeology keeps making the story older and stranger. Shubaika 1 showed that bread-like food came before farming in Southwest Asia. Çatalhöyük showed grain foods embedded in Neolithic household life. Mesopotamian tablets showed cereal accounting at the birth of writing. Egyptian residues showed the technical overlap of baking and brewing. Each discovery removes a little of the distance between your kitchen and the ancient hearth. When you hold bread, you are holding a solved problem and an unsolved one. The solved problem is how to make hard seeds edible, fragrant, shareable, and satisfying. The unsolved problem is how to organize a society around staple food without making hunger a weapon or abundance invisible. Bread did not build the ancient world because it was glamorous. It built the ancient world because it was dependable enough to plan around, portable enough to ration, symbolic enough to worship, and essential enough to fight over. It was there when hunters ground wild grain before farms existed. It was there when scribes pressed numbers into clay. It was there when the Nile fed laborers and kings. It was there when Paris marched on Versailles. And it is sitting in your kitchen right now. The bigger meaning of bread is not that one food magically created civilization. It is that civilization needed foods with certain powers. Bread could store the sun from one season and release it in another. It could feed a labor crew, cross a sea, pay a worker, bless a tomb, mark a class line, and expose a failing government. Its history is the history of humans learning to turn fragile harvests into durable societies, and then learning how dangerous those societies become when the harvest fails or the loaf is withheld. Bread is ordinary because it succeeded so completely. It became the background of life. But for most of history, the background was the thing holding everything up. Subscribe to Tales of the Table for the hidden histories of salt, sugar, coffee, and the foods that quietly rule us.